years ago, the third plenary session of the 11th Communist Party of China Central Committee was convened on this very day, heralding the start of China's reform, opening up and socialist modernization. 40 years on, how should China figure out the way forward? At the commemoration conference, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a speech for the past and future, but what exactly were the messages sent out today? For more discussion on this special moment for China, I'm honored to be joined by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, Professor Chong Ying-mung from Yonsei University, and sitting with us is also Mr. Kishore Mahbubani, Professor in Practice of Public Policy from the National University of Singapore. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Cheng Lei. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. So let me start by asking you all, throughout that 1-hour speech by the Chinese president this morning, what impressed you the most?
Well,
start with you,
I would say that since we are commemorating the 40th anniversary of the great turning point of 1978, if you had asked anybody in 1978, would China be where it is today in 2018? The spectacular progress, President Xi Jinping said that the poverty has gone down by 740 million people. And China's economy in 1980 used to be, in purchasing power parity terms, 10% of that of the United States. In 2014, it became bigger in purchasing power parity terms. So what China has accomplished with the 78 reforms has far exceeded even the wildest dreams of the greatest reformers of that time.
Is that your impression as well, the great achievements that China's made?
You go back to 1978, Chinese per capita income was just less than $60 per person. Now is 8,800.
Amazing.
And go back to 1978, there was no international patent by Chinese, zero. Now China has 1.2 million patents. Okay, in 1978. China has 0 in Fortune 500. Now China has more than 115 Chinese firms listed under Fortune 500. Therefore, China, #1 export countries in the world. Therefore, you cannot really compare. But in his speech, what really struck me most was his idea that China will not seek hegemony. China will work toward creating new order in the world. But I think that's very interesting. He was really committed to the idea of peaceful development and of creating external environment that is favorable to a continuation of reform and innovation. That was very interesting and impressive part.
John, peaceful rise, achievements?
I think there's no doubt that the economic achievement of China in the last 40 years is just tremendous. There's a lot of things to be boasted about. As President Xi mentioned one by one, a lot of things mentioned in that speech. There's no doubt about this. I just want to add one note to that theme. That is, this is achieved against the background that, we're talking about achievement for the largest population on Earth. 1 out of 5 people on planet Earth, and this is unprecedented in history. Almost 30 years of continuous development at double-digit rate for such a large population. This is unprecedented in human history. Now, aside from this, I think I'm most impressed about his speech is about as I think we discussed earlier, about the ideological side. There's a lot of recently. There's a lot of I would call them revisionist thoughts about the Cultural Revolution, for example, about...
And even the idea that we shouldn't mention it anymore.
Right, about the great leap forward, all these things. And I think in his speech, he resoundingly said, these are mistakes. He said this, right? These are mistakes. These are setbacks. He used these 2 words, the mistakes and setbacks. I think that's a very important, resounding conclusion he has reached. I think from his speech, I think this is very, very significant. It sets the direction of this country in the future. We regard our past. Our past is a disaster. The Cultural Revolution is a mistake. It's a setback. He mentioned that. So I think from that point on, this is a very important message, and I think I'm very impressed by him personally saying this.
Professor Mahbubani was quite taken aback, or rather surprised, by the appearance of that line very early on in the speech as well, right?
Yes, certainly. And at the same time, if you look at the speech, and remember that this speech will be heard not just by the 1 in 5 people on planet Earth, 1.4 billion people in China, but also heard by the rest of the world.
And scrutinized.
And for the rest of the world, the most important message, which I'm glad he keeps reiterating, is that China is trying to look not just after China's national interests, but also about the global interests of all of humanity. And I know some people get tired of using this phrase, community of shared destiny. But that's actually a wonderful ideal for the world. Can you imagine an America that says, we are no longer America first. We believe in a community of shared destiny. That's a very different world. So the fact that the fastest growing economic power in the world is focused not just on looking after China, but also is very mindful of global interests, is one reason why China's rise has happened so peacefully over the last 40 years. And by the way, history teaches us that when new great powers emerge, there should be natural turbulence. And so far, touch wood, we've had very limited turbulence, and that shows a kind of a commitment to a peaceful order, which I think he also spoke about, which is very important as China keeps growing and developing.
Professor Moon, you look like you want to jump in.
Yeah, he was right. He was really critical of the existing world order, because now we are going through all kinds of turbulences. Isolation, America first, unilateralism, exclusionary attitude of the people, logic of zero-sum game. All those have become the defining characteristics of today's world order, and we should overcome that. I hope that the United States would come up with that kind of rhetoric, that we got to change the world. But the president of China is saying that we got to change it. That is really ironic and interesting.
But would say that that's all that is. It's rhetoric. That China is still practicing, state subsidies and protectionism and so on.
I would be a little bit cautious to interpret that quote he used from Lenin, that break the new old order and establish a new order. I think how do we interpret that new order? I think I'm a little bit skeptical of the notion that China is trying to introduce an entirely new order to the world governance. I think it's more like this new order has to be recognition of the fact that China is going to play an increasingly more important role. This old order needs reform, needs improvement, and China is willing to work with the big powers in the world.
Integration was the word you used earlier.
I use this phrase, China be integrated into this existing order, playing a more important role. I think that's the new order we're talking about here. It's not a sort of a us against them kind of attitude. I mean, it's really a integration. It's also it's not an antagonist attitude.
No,
I think.
You're saying that China is integrating into the old order. I really don't think that China wants to reform of existing international order,
in cooperation
like
with
the
the
World
European
Trade
countries.
Organization and other organizations, because China cannot go back to so-called existing order.
Well, yeah, but the
spirit is collaborative.
Exactly,
right?
that's the key. In collaboration with the European countries, with Canada, with other developing countries. More important, with other developing countries. I think that's the theme he's talking about.
Actually, I'm somewhat sympathetic to your point of view, because actually what China, what people would have expected China to do as it became stronger and more powerful and so on and so forth would be a China to say, okay, it's my turn now. I'm not going to reshuffle the world order. And it's very clear
it's a very dangerous
that
attitude.
China is actually very happy with many of the existing institutions in the world.
Right.
I was ambassador to the United Nations for over 10 years, from 84 to 89 and 98 to 2004. And each time, actually, when you contrast the American attitude towards the United Nations, which is incredibly hostile, and I saw the hostility at first in my face, the Chinese attitude was one of always supporting the United Nations and also many cardinal principles of the United Nations.
John Bolton's term.
Exactly. Exactly. And so you see, this is why I think, but at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that if the world wants to be realistic, it has to make more space for China. in the New World Order. For example, there was a time when China's votes in the International Monetary Fund were less than Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. That's crazy. Right? The second largest economy in the world cannot have such small percentage of voting shares. So you have to adjust the voting shares. You have to allow the heads of IMF and World Bank to come from Asia, or from China even, you know. So those are the changes that they make. But these are not, you're not fundamentally overturning the world order, but you're adapting it and adjusting it to a new reality.
I absolutely agree.
It's wise for
Let's
China.
talk about China-US, because it's well accepted that China has gotten thus far because of that positive China-US relationship for the past 4 decades. But with now the US taking this new approach to China, what's that going to do to China's reforms?
No, I think the very reason the U.S. is taking very, very unilateral and America first approach has opened the room for Chinese involvement in reforming in international institutions. Therefore, going back to John's point, I would say that China has been pursuing incremental reformistic of international institutions.
Which is wise, is wise.
We are very extremely wise. Therefore, in other
and other countries are supporting that.
Oh yeah, all other countries are supporting it. And also, now while U.S. is distancing itself away from the United Nations, China is still emphasizing the virtue of the United Nations. That's a good thing. And while United States is emphasizing unilateralism, China is emphasizing multilateralism. That's a very, very good and positive aspect.
But this standoff has to
Can I
go
just say a quick word on, sorry to interrupt you, John.
Sure, but you go ahead first,
on the US-China relationship, I would at the same time add the point that, since I'm going to write a book on China-US relations in 2019, that relations between the United States and China will get more difficult in the coming decade. I've spent this whole year on sabbatical, spending time in 3 American universities. And when I was in Harvard and Columbia in February, March, April, this year, I could see relations sliding down. But when I went back in October to Georgetown University, the US-China relations had fallen off a cliff. And I was stunned that the speech that the Vice President Mike Pence gave. It was an incredibly hostile, even insulting speech, saying the only reason why China succeeded is because American missionaries went to China in the 19th century. That's a condescending thing to say. And the fact that the Vice President of America said such a condescending thing was actually quite shocking. But it was also, at the same time, sent a very clear signal that China has to prepare psychologically, politically, in other ways, for a more difficult relationship with the United States. Whatever the short-term bumps are, the next 10 years will be difficult.
How does it prepare? Does it engage more with the US, with China's supporters, with more developing countries?
I think the difficulties between the countries, some people, attribute this to ideological difference. Some people attribute this to a very unique China development model. I think some of these things are a little bit exaggerated, in my opinion. Let's take the ideological issue, for example. This is the debate between the Washington consensus versus the Beijing consensus, right? Now, if you look at the real elements of the China development model, and compare these things, for example, the state-led role, right? The very practical approach, experimental approach, the emphasis on development at all costs, the very efficient, not necessarily sort of a liberal governance, and all these things are not. I think most of these things are not fundamentally in conflict with the core American value. In other words, the ideological difference isn't that great as people would casually imagine. That's the first thing. Second thing is that the issues have been identified by the United States government with respect to China's so-called distortionary trade practices. Right? Their side thinks that these are the reasons behind China's great economic success. I mean, this is a question subject to debate, but that's a different question. I mean, we're going to talk about this later. But the fact that some of these things are not necessarily in conflict with China's interests, right? For example, the protection of intellectual property rights, and I think it's very clear it is our interest. Chinese companies are becoming more involved in protecting their intellectual property rights.
They're being hurt more.
They are actually starting to be hurt more. So these things actually are in China's interest, and we're going to do this anyway. Okay. Another issue,
state subsidy, for example. You know, we have gone through stages where we have massive subsidies in China, and I think it's about time that China is going to scale back these things. Okay, and it's not necessarily in conflict of interest. Let me finish. Okay, final thing. With respect to the SOEs, you know, American government is really complaining about China's SOEs government support. Okay. Chinese government has already said we are willing to entertain this concept called competitive neutrality with respect to state-owned enterprises. That means to level the playing field between state-owned companies and private companies.
And doing are two
right.
things.
So all these things, I think, they're being addressed, and they're actually in China's interest, and they should be part of the continual reform and open door policy agenda. So I think, you know, the conflicts between the two sides, in my opinion,
on paper,
a little bit exaggerated.
I would add a very important qualification, okay? Because you analyze very well the economic dimension, and you're absolutely right. Everything that America is pushing for is in China's interests.
Not everything, but some of it.
Yeah, I mean, the intellectual property and all that. But you must remember that this is a very complex relationship, and you have economics is only one of the slices.
That I agree.
You have a political slice.
Right.
And on the political slice, I would say that despite your point about there not being an ideological dispute, there's actually a very profound ideological dispute on the political side, whether democracy or an authoritarian form of government is a better form of government. Then you have the military slice.
Yeah,
that's hugely contentious.
No, I agree. That I agree.
And then I would add, equally importantly, the cultural slice. And remember that the world has never seen for almost 200 years a non-Western power emerging as the #1 power in the world. And then I would add another slice, which is the slice of primacy. America has become addicted to being #1, and you now suddenly asking someone who's been addicted to being #1 to be prepared to become #2. So that's why I'm writing a book, because it's such a complex, multi-dimensional relationship, and it's important to focus on all the 5 dimensions.
That I agree. That I agree.
The devil is in domestic politics. Yes. Domestic politics amplify trust gap. Look. China says we will not seek hegemony. The more Chinese leader state that, the more Americans think that China will seek hegemony. Okay, China wants to pursue the new norms of mutual respect. Okay, and also new norms of win-win. Okay, and fairness and justice in international relations. And then Americans will say, oh, there is kinds of a camouflage of what Chinese real intention. Then why that? Go back to the strategic gap. Okay, China wants to pursue Road and Belt and Road Initiative. It's very much geo-economic, but Americans will say that's geopolitical move, and then they start with the people to Asia, Indo-Pacific strategy, and etc. Okay, more than that. Now, another important point is this. Look, American has been anchoring in the notion of alliance called the collective defense system. President Xi Jinping argues, no, we want collective alliance security. Assumes common enemy and common threat. It's not the way we should conduct security. Therefore, I want cooperative security, comprehensive security, common security, and sustainable security. And then if, let's say, neighboring countries in Asia wanted to join that initiative, you are betraying American alliance. Therefore, it is really combined. But where all those possession comes, is the whole idea of power.
What is the view from South Korea, by the way?
South Korea, in the short term, we stick to the alliance. But in medium to long term, this security community is the better solution. Multilateral security cooperation.
I meant how it sees China's reform and opening up.
Precisely. If North Korean nuclear issue resolved, and if we have a peace on the Korean Peninsula, then South Korea may support, or unified Korea may support the idea of common, comprehensive, and the sustainable security system. But we have all those kinds of conflicts. But that conflict, the origin of those conflicts are domestic politics. China becomes some kinds of so-called the victim. Okay, and that they need some outside the victims so that they can enhance commanding heights of their domestic politics. It is very sad.
Professor Mahbubani, what's the Singaporean perspective?
Well, I think from Singapore's perspective, it'll be a sad day, and also very difficult for Singapore.
to choose?
If the relations between the United States and China get very difficult, because we are good friends with the United States and we are good friends with China. And we actually believe that we can be good friends with both.
South Korea too.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, I think if the United States could see that in its presence in this region, especially since World War II, has been a major positive factor that has actually enhanced the growth and development of East Asia. I mean, the East Asian miracle story has got many supporting dimensions to it, but the strong American presence, the strong American open markets have fueled the growth of Japan, the Four Tigers, China, and so on and so forth. So it's actually very important for us, therefore, I would say this is true of South Korea, true of Singapore, and true of many countries in this region that are friends with China and the United States, to work together and try and persuade these two powers that any kind of new zero-sum game that replaces what has so far been, for the most part, a cooperative relationship will be a disaster for the two of them and a disaster for the region. And it's very important for us, therefore, that's the reason why I'm writing my book now, to send a message that if you continue this moving towards a collision, you will be hurt and we will also be hurt.
You did an interview in the US where you said that China is very much misunderstood by Americans because they don't get that while political freedom has stagnated, personal freedoms have exploded. They don't get that.
Absolutely. See, I first came to China in 1980, 38 years ago. And when I came to Beijing, people here couldn't choose where to live, where to work, what to wear. They were all wearing Maoist suits, where to study, and certainly they could not travel overseas. No one could travel overseas. Now I come back to Beijing, people can choose where to live, where to work, what to wear, where to study, and each year 138 million Chinese travel overseas. And from the American point of view, 138 million Chinese return to China freely. So when they come home freely, it's a sign that they're very happy with their domestic environment. So this is not the old Soviet Union, which I also visited, and which was a dark and depressing place. I mean, I remember going to a department store in the Soviet Union, and you know, when they sell toothpaste and toothbrushes, they put one toothbrush here, one toothpaste here, in this whole department store,
China
you had less goods than in one small Chinese 7-Eleven store.
Well, Kishore, I agree with everything you said. Other than, I just want to add one cautionary note. Especially, I think you mentioned these ideological differences as reflected in other areas other than just economic model, political, cultural, military, other things. But I think people these days tend to regard the prospect of China taking over the U.S. largest economy as a foregone conclusion. I'm a little bit, weary about reaching that conclusion too fast. Okay, for two reasons.
I'll take a bet with you.
for two reasons. Let me finish. Okay.
One
thing is that if you look at China's economic growth rate, it's slowing down. It's slowing down.
Yeah.
And I think we are very soon to be into the 5% category, actually, GDP growth. Okay. The first. Second is the demographics. The China's population is going to peak off and they're going to come down. Actually, the projection is by 2050 we're going to have only a billion people, whereas the population growth in the United States actually, growing very fast, accelerating actually. So the projection is by 2050 they're going to have 500 million people, close to 5 million.
So let's talk about the challenges facing China's reform and opening up. There's the aging population, the slowing economy. What else?
Look, even when you talk, first of all, I would argue that you never use the power indicators as a way of so-called measuring China-U.S. relations. Power changes, economy ups and downs. Okay, right now Chinese economy hitting the bottom, but it can come back, and China will maintain steady growth. U.S. is peak of the cycle, may go down. And also it is extremely, hold this concept of, power indicators such as growth rate, defense spending, whatever. they are derived from the so-called power transition theory, all the status quo power versus revisionist power. But I think that is really misnomer. That is an extremely contrived way of understanding international politics. China can be great, America can be great, let them share with others.
What I'm saying is that as China looks forward for its reforms, what stands in its way to succeed further, to sustain this momentum? You know, well, John mentioned the aging issue.
Well, I think I agree. I completely agree with John when he says that China faces serious challenges ahead. And I think the biggest mistake for any country is to believe that it has arrived, it can just switch on autopilot and carry on. No country can do that. And even China, as big as it is, can't do that. In fact, that's actually the fundamental strategic mistake that the United States made at the end of the Cold War. It switched on autopilot and went and continued going in a straight line without realizing that the world was changing. And China clearly, I think, understands that as it moves ahead, and especially as you climb up the economic ladder, you have to change and adjust and adapt. But going back to your point about growth, if you know, by the rule of 72, as you know, even if China grows at 6% a year, it will double its GNP in 12 years, right?
And 6% is a big plus.
I think
it's a convergence theory.
But the United States is, by the way, also going to go through a very difficult patch. I mean, at some point in time, if you are fiscally irresponsible, as you know, with this incredibly large budget deficits which are being financed by Asians who are buying US Treasury bonds. Now, at some point in time, that music will stop, you know. So if you talk of long-term challenges that China faces, and there are real challenges that China faces, there are equally serious problems that the United States faces. And if indeed their population grows to 500 million, do you know how many of them will be Hispanic speaking?
Oh yeah, well that's American scale.
But you point out, aging is one factor. You know, every country would go to low fertility and aging population, but income and wealth inequality, polarization of society, environmental issues, climate changes, and regional inequality.
Yes.
Sectoral inequalities. In the case of China, all this problem of state-owned enterprises. You have numerous problems. If you don't have any problems, you don't need to have a reform. Why President Xi Jinping emphasizing reform and innovation?
You're right.
Because China has lots of problems.
All right. We have about a minute left in our program, so I'm going to ask you to sum up, I guess, in one sentence or two, about what you see ahead for China's reforms and opening up.
Well, I believe that since China has succeeded so well in 40 years through a process of constant reforms, China will keep reforming, but they'll follow Deng Xiaoping's method of feeling your way, feeling the stones in the river as you cross the river, and that's the best approach to take.
The very fact that Chinese leadership is aware of its weakness and structural impediment, that's a really good sign. I hope that China would go for a steady growth, not rapid growth, carrying, focusing on more on steady and inclusive growth.
Well, let's face the fact and be honest. In the last few years, I think China's reform and open door course have been a little bit stagnant for several years. And I think his speech set the stage for some drastic changes now. I think the country cannot afford not to make those changes if we keep the current path. And we have to change. The world is changing.
We want to see more bold reforms. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for a very active and insightful discussion. Professor Kishore Mahbubani from the National University of Singapore, Professor Chung Yee-moon from Yonsei University, and Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. And this was Dialogue. I'm Cheng Lei, sitting in for Yang Rui. See you soon.